There are moments in history so strange, so impossible, that when they are recorded, no one believes them. Moments that violate every rule of how we think power works, how we think cruelty functions, how we think the world is supposed to end for the powerless. This is one of those moments. A moment witnessed by thousands, documented by multiple sources, and then quietly buried because no one knew what to do with it. A man was thrown into a ring with 6 bulls. Not as entertainment, not as sport, as execution, as punishment for daring to exist in a way that offended a barren sense of order. The crowd gathered. The bulls were released, and then something happened that no one could have predicted. This is not a story about heroism. This is a story about what happens when a system designed to crush human beings encounters something it cannot account for. The place was Colonial, Brazil. The time was 1729. The man's name has been lost to history, erased like so many others. But what he did in that arena was recorded in letters, in journals, in official documents that still exist today. What if the most dangerous thing a person can do is not to fight back, but to refuse to be what the powerful expect them to be? Colonial Brazil in the early 18th century was a place of unimaginable brutality. Sugar plantations stretched across the landscape, each one a small kingdom ruled by men who held absolute power over hundreds of enslaved human beings. These men called themselves barons, masters. They built churches, they funded religious festivals. They wrote letters to Europe about civilization and progress. And in private, in the quarters where enslaved people lived, in the fields where they worked from sunrise to sunset, these same men enacted a violence so systematic, so total, that it defined every moment of every day. The legal code gave slave owners the right to punish however they saw fit. Mutilation was legal. Branding was legal. Murder, if justified as discipline, was rarely prosecuted. The system was designed to break not just bodies but spirits. But resistance happened anyway. Every day. In the way people preserved languages, the masters tried to erase. In the way they practiced religions, the church tried to destroy. And sometimes, in the way they simply refused to perform the role assigned to them. On a plantation near Salvador da Bahia, there lived a man whose name the records do not preserve. The documents refer to him only as the condemned, but they describe him in detail. They say he was tall, strong, scarred from previous punishments. And they say he did something that so enraged the baron who owned the plantation that the baron decided an ordinary execution would not suffice. What exactly did this man do? The records are vague. Some say he spoke back to an overseer. Some say he refused a direct order. One letter suggests the offense was religious, that he was caught practicing what the church called sorcery. Another hints at something more personal. But the specific crime almost does not matter. What matters is what happened next. The baron decided to make an example so spectacular that it would be remembered for generations. He ordered the construction of an arena. Not a small ring, a proper arena, large enough to hold hundreds of spectators, with walls high enough that nothing inside could escape. He sent announcements to neighboring plantations, to the town, to local authorities. He invited everyone to witness justice. And he ordered 6 bulls to be brought to the plantation. 6 of the most aggressive animals his workers could find. Bulls that had already killed. The man would be thrown into the arena unarmed. The bulls would be released, and the crowd would watch as nature took its course. This was not unusual. Execution by animals stretched back to Roman times, a spectacle designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. Today, come. The crowd gathered. Hundreds of people pressed against the arena walls. Plantation owners with their families. Overseers. Free people of color who came because refusing the invitation was dangerous. Enslaved people forced to watch because the lesson was meant for them. The man was brought out. His hands were not bound. There was no point. The walls were too high. The gates were guarded. One witness, a merchant who later wrote about the event, described the man's face. He said the man did not look afraid. Not big. He stood in the center and looked up at the baron, his expression unreadable. The first bull was released. If you have never seen a fighting bull up close, you cannot understand the terror. These are not farm animals. These are creatures bred for aggression, for power. A bull can weigh over a ton, run faster than any human. Its horns can pierce through a body like paper. The bull charged. The crowd held its breath. This was supposed to last seconds, but the man moved. Not away. Toward. He stepped into the bull's path, and at the last possible moment, he twisted. His hand reached out. He grabbed the bull's horn, and he used the bull's own momentum to flip it. The bull hit the ground. The man released it. The bull scrambled up, confused, and charged again. Again the man moved. Again he grabbed. Again he flipped. The crowd was silent. This was not supposed to happen. The Baron ordered the second bull released. Now there were 2 bulls in the arena, 2 massive animals, both enraged, both focused on the man in the center. The merchant's letter describes what happened next. He writes that the man seemed to know where each bull was at all times, that he moved between them like water, that when one charged from the left and the other from the right, he dropped to the ground and let them collide. And then, impossibly, he began to control them, not through force, through movement, through timing, through an understanding that should not have been possible. The third bull was released, then the fourth, then the fifth, then the sixth. 6 bulls in the arena. 1 unarmed man, and the man was still standing. If you are finding this story valuable, consider subscribing. These are the stories that matter. Where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. The witnesses describe what happened next in almost mystical terms. They say the bulls stopped charging. They say the man somehow made them circle him. They say he touched their heads, one by one, and the bulls became calm. A priest who was present wrote that he witnessed a miracle, that God had protected the innocent. But another witness, a plantation overseer, wrote something different. He wrote that the man used techniques he had clearly learned somewhere, that the movements were too precise to be improvisation, that this was knowledge, not magic. Where would an enslaved man in colonial Brazil learn to control fighting bulls? Historians now believe it points to something the European colonizers tried to erase. Evidence of sophisticated cultural knowledge that survived the Middle Passage. Evidence that some enslaved people brought expertise in animal handling from African traditions. In certain regions of West Africa, cattle herding was not just a profession but a sacred practice. Young men were trained for years in how to move with animals, how to read their behavior, how to establish dominance without violence. When people were captured and enslaved, some of that knowledge came with them. But the man in the arena was not supposed to have that knowledge. He was property. He was meant to be helpless. And his refusal to be helpless, his demonstration that he possessed skills the system insisted he could not have, was more threatening than any rebellion. The Baron sat in his seat above the arena. The merchant's letter describes his face as frozen, because what was happening below violated the logic that justified everything he believed. If this man could do this, if this property could demonstrate this level of skill and courage, what did that say about the system? What did that say about the idea that some people were born to rule and others born to serve? The crowd began to murmur. Some called for the man to be freed. Some called it a sign from God. The enslaved people who had been forced to watch said nothing, but their faces showed something one witness called dangerous hope. The Baron stood. He raised his hand. The murmuring stopped. He ordered the gates opened. He ordered armed men into the arena. He ordered the man seized and removed. Not killed. Not yet. Because to kill him now would be to admit something the Baron could not admit. The man was taken back to the plantation. The crowd was dispersed, and the Baron spent 3 days deciding what to do. Here is where the story becomes darker. Because the man had not died in the arena, he had demonstrated his humanity so undeniably that even people who supported slavery were shaken. So the Baron did what the powerful always do when their power is challenged. 3 days later, the man was found dead in his quarters. The official record says natural causes. A letter from the priest says poison. Another document suggests he was strangled. The man who survived the bulls did not survive what came after. The Baron ordered that no one speak at the arena. He had the structure torn down. He threatened anyone who wrote about it, and for a long time, it worked. The story faded. It became rumor, except the documents survived. In church archives, in private letters, in the journal of a traveling merchant. And what those documents tell us is this: the man who walked into that arena was supposed to die. The system required it. His death was necessary to maintain the fiction that enslaved people were less than human. But he did not die, not when he was supposed to. And in those minutes, when he stood in that arena, when he controlled those bulls, when he demonstrated undeniably that he was as human as any person watching, he broke something. He broke the story the powerful told themselves. And because he broke it, he had to be erased, not just killed, but erased from memory so that what he proved could be forgotten. But here we are, centuries later. And the story survived. What does this story tell us? Perhaps it tells us that the most subversive act is not violence, but competence. That the most dangerous thing an oppressed person can do is demonstrate they possess the same capacity for skill and courage as their oppressors. That the real threat to systems of oppression is not rebellion, but humanity refusing to be hidden. Perhaps it tells us that power is fragile, that it requires constant performance, constant violence, to maintain the illusion that it is natural, and that when someone refuses to play their assigned role, the entire structure trembles. Or perhaps it tells us something more disturbing. That systems of oppression can tolerate rebellion, they expect Italiano. They have mechanisms to crush it. But they cannot tolerate proof of equality. They cannot tolerate moments when the lie becomes visible, and when those moments happen, the response is erasure. The man in the arena was not killed for resisting. He was killed for succeeding. The baron who threw him into that arena believed he was demonstrating power. Instead, he created a spectacle of humanity, and then he spent the rest of his life trying to bury it. But the documents remain. The truth remains, waiting in archives for people to find it. If this man could do what he did, how many others could have done the same if given the chance? How much knowledge, how much skill, how much human potential was destroyed in those centuries of slavery? How many moments like this happened and were successfully erased? And in our own time, when we watch power try to crush humanity, when we watch systems insist that some people are worth less than others, what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? The bulls in that arena were not the enemy. They were tools, like Tay-Whip, like the chains. The enemy was the idea that some people are predators and some are prey, that nature itself justifies cruelty. And the man who stood in that arena proved the idea was a lie. He proved it in front of hundreds of witnesses. He proved it so undeniably that the powerful had no choice but to kill him and try to kill the memory. But memory is stubborn. Truth is stubborn. And sometimes, if we look hard enough, if we are willing to sit with the discomfort of what history shows us, we find these stories. This is not a story with a happy ending. The man died. His name was forgotten. The baron faced no consequences. The system continued for more than a century. But the story survived. And that matters. Because every time we remember, every time we refuse to let these truths be buried, every time we insist on asking the uncomfortable questions about power and violence, we are doing what that man did in the arena. We are refusing to play the role assigned to us. We are demonstrating that the story is a lie. The arena is gone. The plantation is gone. The baron is gone. But the question remains, when power builds a spectacle to demonstrate its own inevitability, what happens when someone refuses to cooperate? The answer is that power will do everything it can to make sure it never happens again. The answer is that the man will die. The answer is that the story will be buried. But the answer is also that we are here, centuries later, telling the story. So, here's my question for you. When you encounter power that insists some people are worth less than others, when you see systems that demand we accept cruelty as natural, what will you do? Will you watch silently? Will you look away? Or will you remember the man whose name we do not know, who stood in the center of the arena and refused to be what they said he was? Because that might be the only revenge possible. Not justice. Justice is gone. But the chance to remember, the chance to refuse to let his death mean nothing, that chance remains. The man survived. The bulls. He did not survive what came after. But for those minutes when he stood in that arena and the crowd watched in silence, the lie was visible to everyone, and that is why we are still talking about it. Not because it has a happy ending, but because it proves that happy endings were always possible. That humanity was always there, waiting to be seen. And the man in the arena stopped pretending, and for a moment, everyone else had to stop pretending too. And then the moment ended, and the forgetting began. But the documents remained, and now you know it. So what will you do with it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what this story makes you feel, because remembering together is how we make sure the forgetting never becomes complete. The man whose name we do not know walked into an arena of bulls and walked out alive. And for that, he was killed. And for that, he deserves to be remembered. Not as a hero, not as a symbol, but as a human being who refused to cooperate with his own dehumanization. And that refusal was more powerful than 6 bulls. More powerful than the Baron. More powerful than the entire system that demanded his destruction. It was not powerful enough to save him, but it was powerful enough to survive him. And centuries later, we are still talking about it, and that has to mean something.